Hello, and welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. At some point in your career, if not already, you'll have to jump in the middle of a project on fire. You'll have to call the client or walk into a meeting knowing that you only have bad news to share. It's a scary situation that I've personally been fortunate to be a part of. Wait, what? Am I saying that I've been happy to have had to rescue projects in the past? Well, no, not happy. But I can honestly say they taught me more than any successful project I've ever had. If you're lucky, you've got a good mentor or team member to help you out during those times. But today, I'm talking to one of the best project firefighters I've ever had the pleasure of working with, Brad Amundson. Brad is currently a senior producer for Carmichael Lynch, and he's going to share some of his best tactics for handling an exploding project. Take a listen as we jump right into the action. Let's use the scenario that either the project had to be transitioned because the PM left or PM is unavailable and now it needs to be moved. What are some of the first areas that you really dive into to get a good understanding of where it's at?
In most of the situations that I've been in, I'm the one ultimately that's going to have to communicate to the client the status of their project and what's going to happen next and what are the outcomes that we're all driving towards. Especially if a project's off the rails, you want to make sure that you get in front of that client ASAP.
So obviously the best way would be to be introduced to the client by either the exiting PM or maybe an account person or something along those lines, right? It isn't just you just pick up the phone and blindly call them, right?
Sometimes it can be, depending on the situation.
Sure.
No, but I think that, yes, if there is an introduction that can be made, and also being very transparent at what's going to happen next, because you're going to get on the phone that first time and you're not going to have the answers. You're not going to be equipped to have a conversation with the client about what's next and what's going to come next. So it is just you're trying to be the world's best customer service agent at that point. You're going to say, listen, I've gotten an overview. I understand that you've got some things that are going off the rails, some things that you've got questions about that you haven't been able to get answers from my company about. It is my job to get that information from you, talk to the team, and get back to you as quickly as I can.
Let's say the client has no idea things are off the rails.
Yeah.
And the project was moved because it is off the rails. And now how do you approach that initial conversation? I'm guessing, again, you don't pick up the phone and say, hi, I'm Brad, I'm your new project manager, and your project's about to explode. How do you kind of navigate that?
One of the things I personally do when I get put in that position of I need to understand what's going on is I go through all of the documentation that is there. I go through all the project plans. I go through all of the budgets, all of the spreadsheets. I talk to everybody who's been working on the project internally before I go to that conversation with the client, because I need to make sure that I'm not going in there unable to speak to any aspect of the project. I need to be in there. And I mean, I've gone as far as, you read the entire scope and then you go into the budget and you're looking at every cell and every calculation and making sure that each of those calculations is accurate. I had a situation where the client had seen 8 different budgets, but nobody put all of those budgets together and added them up for them. And then they were surprised at what that total was. Now, in that situation, it's establishing yourself as the person that is going to make things better for them and that customer service agent, because you're building a little bit of a personal and professional relationship in that the fact that you've been placed there because their management has trust in you in that you can solve these problems. So you've got to come in and be like, we'll get through this. I'm here for you. I empathize with you. And then actually just deliver the news. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, but you're there to negotiate too. I think the biggest problem people have when they come to take over projects is that they try and toe the same line the person before them was trying to toe. So I've been in another situation where we were 95% done with the project and we're arguing over the letter of the scope versus what needs to be done versus this, that, and the other thing. And I just came in and said, let's not argue over the little things. Let's get to the crux of the issue, which is, are you dissatisfied with the service that I'm providing? well, then let me get all this little stuff off the table, and then let's talk about that. In project management, you have to look over the bottom line and make sure your company's staying profitable. But there are other things that are more detrimental to the bottom line, like a dissatisfied customer that's out there talking about you in the market. You have to get past the little things and make sure that they understand that you're there to take care of them.
I, too, have also taken over projects mid-flight, and I think it's what you said is really important. What you want to do is you want to make sure you have focused conversations. Don't try to tackle all the problems at once, right? Try to figure out what is the biggest blocker in front of you and try to focus 100% on addressing that first.
Yeah.
And I think that's hard sometimes for clients because or any stakeholder is they want all the things, want to fix all the things all the time. And you've got to be that good guide that helps them. Let's do this one thing first. Let's knock this out. And once we're past this, then we got the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. So you mentioned a few things. So one is obviously doing some forensics, looking for documentation, making sure you understand the history of the project, right? Learning how we got here, right? What about the team part of it, right? So obviously you go through the documentation. I'm guessing one of the next steps is to talk to the people that are actually working on the project, right? How do you normally approach them? What are some of the questions you might ask them to get a better understanding?
A lot of times people just assume because developers may not be working directly with the client or being a part of every conversation that happens with the client, that they're not punch drunk. You know, they're just as affected as well because, I mean, they've got a project manager showing up to their desk every other day telling them this, switch it on and then switch it off and then switch it on and then change it to blue and then, you know, make it a slider and then, you know, add a dollar sign. You know, that stuff just gets old and repetitive. And I think that they start to feel a little disconnected from what are we actually trying to solve? So I think you have to come into that conversation with a little bit of empathy and being like, listen, I know you've been put in a kind of a rough spot and you may not completely understand what's going on the client side or vice versa in terms of communications and negotiations. Let me fill you in on that as well. Let me get you up to speed on what I'm doing with the client so that you can better understand why I'm asking you to do some things that you may have had a conversation on a dozen times being out of scope. And now I'm telling you, we're going to do it and we're going to do it for free. So it is discussing as much strategy with the developer so they're up to speed, because ultimately when you're taking over a project, those developers and those people that are still on the project, they're your resources. They're the pieces of information. They're the ones who, you know, may have been on a call that nobody wrote down the note that remembered that somebody said, actually, we want you to do that. It's intentional and there's a reason. They're going to be your guides too, because I oftentimes will get an email from a client. I want to make sure that I'm responding appropriately. I'll go talk to the developers and be like, all right, this is what they said. Here's what I think. Can you validate that for me? And I think getting them to be part of the solution and part of the strategy helps them get to the point of thinking about the end of the project, the light at the end of the tunnel. Like, you know what? They asked for this. We can't do it with the technology that we have. But with the technology we have, we can propose option A and option B. And then they start to feel like they're part of the solution and they're part of the team getting that thing to the finish line or to the next phase.
So one of the things I heard you say in there was kind of reiterating the goals, right? So you do the documentation deep dive, you talk with the team, you kind of figure out what their perspective is, but what are some tactics you've used in the past to get those goals from a client?
I've joked in the past with other project managers and other people that I've worked with in development shops. You know, we always say features, timeline, or budget. You know, what's your real driver? I think that the features forward model is kind of a myth because eventually there will be a number or a timeline that will make your client squeal and make them uncomfortable.
Yeah, I would totally agree because I've never taken on a project where, honestly, the majority of the time budget is the driver. I mean, people do not have endless coffers and they're not Scrooge McDuck diving into a big vault of gold. They've got a limited amount of resources to get this stuff done. But they might have promised quite a bit to their stakeholders or their customers on what the solution is going to actually provide.
Yeah, so I think understanding the constraints that they have on their side in terms of feature or budget or what they've also promised to a third party or a client or or whatnot. Understanding that and then being able to intelligently speak to what's there and making sure, and I think this is really important, especially when you're dealing with user experience and creative and things like that, when you're taking that into development and then all of a sudden the development no longer fits their budget, making sure that they really understand the features and impact on the product or the item that the software product and what they actually do. A lot of times you see something on paper and everybody nods their head, and then you get to the end of the project and they see it in reality and it's clickable and they're like, oh, that's what that does. It's a lot easier to have the conversation about budget and timeline and feature prioritization if everybody understands every aspect of the product or the thing that we're building. A lot of times it can be as much of a coaching or mentoring moment, especially for clients, when you're actually in there saying, all right, we already have established what the goals of this project are. Now let's talk about how those features align to them and how they align to the expectations and deliverables that you have to either your third party or your bosses or whatnot, to talk about, can we break this up? Does this all need to be done on launch day? There are a number of different tactics for having that conversation, but I think having a good understanding of every aspect of it and making sure your client does too will help facilitate that conversation a lot quicker.
That's interesting because, a lot of times the designers and the developers are not working as one team. There's a lot of time there's a handoff or something. So when you're trying to get that consensus across the team, what are some of the ways that you do that? Do you get everybody in a room and you pull up the wires or the prototype or whatever the thing is and then just walk through the entire thing? Like, what are some of the ways that you would go about that?
When I'm going through and prepping for this is, that documentation step in the process, I go through all of the wires and I make sure that I understand things. I'll talk to the designers, I'll talk to the UX team, I'll talk to the developers, make sure I have a good sense. But then when I start to incorporate the client's feedback and the client's wants and needs and things like that, that's when I'll start to pull the team back together behind the scenes. Once we've identified a few pain points, then we'll get the cross-discipline team together to try and triage that specific need so that we can come in to that conversation where we're actually talking about how we get this thing back on track or back towards our goals, that we're coming to the table with solutions and options to say, you know what, this one piece of functionality is a minor sticking point and we could actually pull it back a little bit to give us the resources and time we need to address this major pain point. You have to be a little bit of an arbitrator and just, be there knowing that, making sure your client understands that your problems and their problems we're working together to solve it.
And there you have it. I want to thank Brad for stopping by to talk about how to best manage a project rescue. Please be sure to help me out and subscribe to the podcast. If you have ideas you want to share on this subject, find me on Twitter @KRTS. I'd love to keep the conversation going. Thanks for listening.